September 4th, 1944. Private Thomas Harris from Simcoe, Ontario, stands on the dock at Antwerp and cannot quite believe what he is looking at. The port is intact. Every crane is standing, warehouse roofs whole, rail lines running clean to loading bays without a single crater. He has spent 3 months watching the Allied advance turn everything in its path into rubble, and he expected Antwerp to look like Caen. Instead, it looks like a port on a Tuesday morning waiting for ships that have not arrived yet. His sergeant walks past and says without stopping that they got lucky. Thomas nods and looks at the cranes and thinks, yes, we got very lucky. He does not know yet that luck and a working port are not the same thing. He does not know that the water stretching northwest from those cranes is about to become the most expensive 50 miles in the entire war. The Scheldt estuary runs from Antwerp to the North Sea. It is not dramatic water. No cliffs, no famous straits, no names in history books. Flat, cold, tidal, gray. In September 1944, every meter of both its banks is held by German forces who have had years to position their guns exactly where they need to be. Any ship sailing from the North Sea toward Antwerp must travel straight through 50 miles of estuary under whatever the Germans choose to point at it. The most intact major port in Western Europe, captured without a fight, sitting on functioning rail infrastructure, is completely useless. Thomas does not know any of this on September 4th. What he knows is that his boots are dry for the first time in a week, and someone has found tinned peaches, and his section is passing them around on the dock in the late afternoon light. The war feels almost over. Allied arrows on newspaper maps point everywhere across France and Belgium. German divisions collapsing. Towns liberated faster than staff officers can update their situation maps. People in England already talking about Christmas. Thomas finishes his peaches and looks out across the Scheldt and thinks about his mother's kitchen in Simcoe and whether the apple trees have come in yet this year. 300 kilometers northeast, in a headquarters tent in Brussels, General Bernard Montgomery stands over a different map entirely. Beret tilted, pointer tapping the Rhine. He is the most decorated British general of the war, and he moves through every room like a man who has never once considered the possibility that he might be wrong. He is looking at Arnhem. He is looking at a plan called Market Garden, an airborne assault so large that if it succeeds, it jumps the Rhine in a single stroke, bypasses the entire German line, and puts Allied forces on the road to Berlin before winter, the kind of plan that ends wars in November instead of the following year. He has been told about the Scheldt. Eisenhower's chief of staff said it clearly. Admiral Ramsey put it in writing. The Scheldt must be cleared before anything else. The supply situation is approaching crisis. Allied armies across France and Belgium are running out of fuel because the lines stretching from the Normandy beaches are hundreds of miles long and breaking under the strain. Antwerp could fix everything, but Antwerp requires clearing the Scheldt first, and clearing the Scheldt means grinding infantry through flooded lowland against prepared German positions, and that does not look like genius on a map. Market Garden looks like genius. Montgomery chooses genius. On September 17th, more than 1,000 Allied aircraft fill the sky over Holland. Paratroopers drop on Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem, the largest airborne operation in history. Thomas Harris watches the planes from a billet in Antwerp and feels the floor vibrate through his boots. The man beside him says they must have won the war today. Maybe, Thomas says, looking at the cranes standing motionless in the harbor behind them. By September 25th, Market Garden is over. The bridge at Arnhem holds German. 17,000 Allied casualties. The Rhine uncrossed. The supply crisis deeper than before.
Entire armored divisions sitting in Belgium with empty fuel tanks, and now 3 more weeks of German engineers improving every defensive position along 50 miles of cold estuary that should have been cleared a month ago. The port of Antwerp sits intact and silent. Thomas Harris receives new orders October 1st. His battalion moves west toward the estuary. The briefing is 4 sentences. The Scheldt must be cleared, both banks, every position, however long it takes. The sergeant folds the map and looks at the section and says nothing else. Outside the farmhouse window, the Scheldt moves gray and cold in the October light. Somewhere along those 50 miles, 13,000 Canadians will go into that water before the last German gun goes quiet. The cranes in Antwerp harbor stand perfectly still and wait.
October 6th, 1944. Thomas Harris steps into the Scheldt for the first time at 2 in the morning, and the cold hits him like a wall. Not the dry Canadian winter snap he knows from Simcoe that burns your nose and turns breath visible. This is North Sea autumn water, 9 degrees, heavy with salt and tidal current, and it finds every gap in his uniform within 30 seconds. By the time the water reaches his chest, he is holding his rifle above his head with both arms, and his legs have gone from cold to burning to something that no longer feels like legs. The man behind him is Private Roy Saunders from Guelph. The man ahead is Corporal Dennis Webb from Kingston. They do not speak. Speaking means opening your mouth in the dark, and the dark in the Scheldt in October has weight. Somewhere on the far bank, a German machine gun sits behind a dike reinforced over 3 extra weeks because a British general chose a bridge at Arnhem over 50 miles of estuary. Thomas does not think about that. Thomas thinks about the next step and keeping the rifle dry. The Scheldt in October 1944 is not one battlefield. It is several stacked in the worst possible combination. The South Beveland Peninsula stretches west from the mainland, sitting mostly below sea level, kept dry for generations by dikes and pumps the Germans have now turned into a fortification network. They opened some dikes themselves, deliberately flooding fields that had been farmland for centuries, turning the landscape into a maze of cold water and raised causeways where the only paths forward are obvious and already zeroed in by every gun they have. The choice each hour is between cold and invisible or dry and dead. Thomas and his section spend 4 days on the Beveland Causeway, a narrow raised strip of road wide enough for 2 vehicles, exposed on both sides, covered by German guns at the far end. The battalion tries twice in daylight and loses men both times to fire from positions they cannot flank because there is nothing on either side but water. The third attempt goes at night, wading through flooded fields beside the causeway, rifles above heads, every step uncertain in the dark. Thomas goes in at 2 in the morning and comes out the other side at 5, shaking so hard he cannot hold the mug someone presses into his hands. Roy Saunders does not come out. They find him the next morning still in the water, 20 meters from the bank. The supply situation behind them is getting no better. In Brussels, Allied staff work round the clock on a mathematics problem with no clean solution. Armies need fuel. Fuel needs ships. Ships need ports. The only port large enough is Antwerp. Antwerp needs the Scheldt cleared. Meanwhile, truck convoys drive round trips of 600 miles from Normandy beaches to keep frontline units supplied. Drivers sleep 4 hours and drive again. Entire armored divisions sit idle in Belgian fields with fuel enough for 20 miles. Eisenhower has told Montgomery in direct language that the Scheldt is the absolute priority. Montgomery manages from a distance, visiting rarely, writing memoranda about strategic coherence from a headquarters tent where the maps are updated 3 times daily and the temperature is nothing like 9 degrees. Polish soldiers from General Maczek's 1st Armored Division work the eastern flank alongside the Canadians. Maczek's men have their own reasons for being in this water. Their country was invaded first, occupied before Canada fired a single shot, and the government they are fighting to restore will be handed to the Soviets at a conference table before their boots are dry.
Some of them already know this. They go into the water anyway, because the job in front of them is the job in front of them. Thomas watches a Polish sergeant pull a wounded Canadian from a flooded ditch one afternoon and thinks about something his father once told him about neighbors, that a real neighbor shows up when the work is ugly. November arrives with no improvement in the weather. Thomas has stopped counting days. He counts by dry socks, of which he has had 2 pairs in 3 weeks, and by the names that no longer answer at morning roll call.
November 1st, 1944. The RAF has been bombing the Walcheren dikes for 2 weeks, and the island is drowning in its own defense. German engineers opened the eastern dikes first, deliberately, strategically, flooding the polders to slow any Allied advance from the mainland. Then the bombs opened the western ones, and now Walcheren is an island that is also a lake. German gun batteries sitting on the remaining dry strips of dike like teeth on a jawbone above gray water. The assault troops going ashore at Westkapelle this morning are not landing on a beach. They are landing on the edge of a flooded island to fight men dug into positions above the waterline, while the North Sea runs rough and several landing craft broach in the surf before they reach the shore. Thomas Harris is not at Westkapelle. He is on South Beveland, moving west through flooded fields that smell of salt and mud and something older underneath. The particular cold of land that has been underwater before and remembers it. His world has contracted to the width of a dike path and the distance between one step and the next. He has been in the Scheldt for 26 days. He has slept in wet clothes on wet ground for most of them. His hands have stopped looking like his hands. The farmers who owned these fields are gone. Their houses stand above the waterline, shutters closed, doors locked, belongings left in the speed of evacuation. Thomas and his section move through a farmyard on the morning of November 3rd and find a child's wooden toy horse sitting on the kitchen table of a house the owners left 3 weeks ago. The bread tin is still on the counter. The calendar on the wall shows October. Someone has marked off each day until October 12th and then stopped. Thomas looks at the calendar and the bread tin and the toy horse and walks back out into the water without touching any of it. Corporal Dennis Webb from Kingston moves up beside him. Neither speaks. There is nothing to say that the calendar did not already say better. The German defenders on South Beveland are not fanatics. They are experienced soldiers who understand ground and water and the mathematics of defensive positions. A man behind a dike with a machine gun covering the one raised path through flooded field does not need to be a fanatic. He needs to stay still and wait. The Canadians attacking need to find another way through water that offers no cover and is cold enough to kill a man who stays in too long. The solution worked out over bloody days is to move at night, slowly, in small groups, feeling for the bottom with each step, accepting cold as a condition rather than an obstacle. Thomas learns to read the water, which sections run faster and suggest channels, which smell of disturbed mud and suggest mines, which carry sounds differently than still open ground. He learns things about water he did not know existed as knowledge, that a man can learn in 3 weeks in the Scheldt what takes a lifetime to learn anywhere else, and that most of what you learn is paid for by the men beside you. Private Eddie Kowalski from Brantford steps on a shoe mine on the morning of November 5th on a raised path between 2 flooded fields. The mine is designed to maim rather than kill. It does its job. Thomas gets a tourniquet on in 90 seconds, which the medic later says probably saved the leg. The leg is not saved. Eddie goes back on a stretcher, and Thomas does not see him again. That afternoon, Thomas lies on top of a dike for 40 minutes, unable to advance because a German MG-42 has the path zeroed from 300 meters. Every attempt to move draws a burst close enough to feel displaced air. He lies in wet clothes and waits. Artillery eventually silences the position. Moving forward, Thomas finds 2 German soldiers, one dead,
one sitting against the dike wall with a shoulder wound, looking at the approaching Canadians with an expression that Thomas will think about for years. Not fear exactly, exhaustion that has gone so deep it came out the other side into something quiet. Thomas gives him water from his own canteen without deciding to. It is not a decision. The German takes it with both hands and nods. They wait together on the dike for stretcher bearers. Dennis Webb stands watch at the far end, saying nothing. The Dutch civilians returning on roads behind the Canadian advance are beginning to understand what is being done for them and at what cost. An old Dutch farmer crosses Thomas's path on the evening of November 6th, pushing a bicycle with a flat tire. He stops when he sees the Canadians and removes his hat. He does not speak English. Thomas does not speak Dutch. The man holds his hat in both hands and nods, once, slowly, the way you nod when words are not enough and you know it. Thomas nods back. 3 seconds. The farmer puts his hat on and pushes his bicycle east. Thomas turns west, toward the water.
November 8, 1944. The last German position on the Scheldt estuary goes quiet at 14 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, and Thomas Harris is sitting on a dike near Middelburg when it happens, and his body does not know what to do with the silence. For 33 days, his nervous system has been calibrated to the sound of the estuary at war. The MG-42 bursts, the crump of mortars landing in water, the particular hollow echo a shell makes when it detonates in flooded ground rather than solid earth. And now there is nothing, and the nothing is not peaceful. It is the silence of a room where something has been removed, and the shape of the absence is still visible on the walls. Dennis Webb comes and sits beside him on the dike. Neither speaks. The Scheldt is cleared. Both banks, every German gun that covered 50 miles of estuary silent or destroyed or surrendered. And somewhere in Brussels, staff officers are already drawing up convoy schedules and calculating how many days before the first ship docks at Antwerp. And Thomas knows none of that. Thomas knows only the names that stopped answering at roll call. Roy Saunders from Guelph, still in the water 20 meters from the bank. Eddie Kowalski from Brantford, on a hospital ship somewhere with one leg fewer than he started with. A private named Mitchell from Chatham, who went into a flooded field on October 19th and was found 3 days later half a kilometer downstream, carried there by the tidal current in the dark while his battalion was still trying to find him. 7 men from Thomas's battalion in the first 2 weeks alone. The 1st Canadian Army's total casualties for the Scheldt campaign will be counted later at approximately 13,000. 13,000 is a number that does not sound like 13,000 until you try to picture 13,000 individual mornings. 13,000 men who woke up on some October or November day and went into the water and came out different or did not come out at all. British formations under Canadian command add thousands more. Polish soldiers from Maczek's division add their own names to the count. Men who fought for a country the Allied powers were already quietly negotiating away at conference tables in Moscow and Tehran. Men who knew it and went into the water anyway. On November 28th, 3 weeks after the guns go quiet, the first Allied convoy sails into Antwerp harbor, 85 days after the port was captured intact. 85 days of men dying in flooded fields to open 50 miles of water so that fuel could reach tanks sitting idle in Belgian fields, so that a war that had stalled could move again. The cranes that stood still for 85 days begin to move. Nobody holds a ceremony on the docks. There is no announcement that specifically names what the Canadians did in the Scheldt. In his headquarters, Montgomery is writing a letter to his superiors from a warm office in dry clothes 23 days after the last Canadian came out of the water. And he writes that the 1st Canadian Army performed adequately, but lacked the grip that a great commander requires. And he writes that Crerar was not a man of outstanding ability. And he signs his name and seals the envelope, and the letter travels up the chain of command and is noted and filed. Thomas Harris reads none of it. Thomas Harris is moving east with his battalion toward Germany, 7 names in his head that will not leave, thinking about the Dutch farmer with the flat-tire bicycle who stood in the road and held his hat in both hands and could not find words and did not need them. Thinking about the German soldier on the dike drinking from his canteen with both hands and nodding once. Thinking about the calendar in the farmhouse kitchen marked off to October 12th and then stopped, and whether whoever marked those days off has come home yet to finish it. He does not think about Montgomery or supply lines or strategic importance. He thinks about Roy Saunders, 20 meters from the bank. He thinks about 13,000 individual mornings that ended in water, that the newspapers did not write about, and the generals did not celebrate, and no monument in any town square will ever name beside Normandy and Ortona and the Rhineland. The water that cost everything and bought the war its next breath and asked for nothing back except the men who crossed it.
Nobody photographed the first convoy sailing into Antwerp on November 28, 1944. No front page, no ceremony on the docks, no general standing at a podium naming the men who made it possible. A gray November morning, cranes beginning to move after 85 days of standing still, fuel and ammunition coming ashore for armies that had been sitting idle in Belgian fields running on empty, and the world did not notice because the world was looking somewhere else, which is the most accurate thing you can say about the entire Scheldt campaign from beginning to end. Thomas Harris was already moving east by then, boots drying slowly on his feet, 7 names in his head that roll call would never answer again. Crossing into Germany through towns whose names he would not remember, past civilians who stood in doorways wearing the same expression the German soldier on the dike had worn, exhaustion gone so deep it came out the other side into something quiet. He did not think about convoys or supply lines. He thought about Mitchell from Chatham, found 3 days after he went in, carried half a kilometer downstream by the tidal current in the dark. He thought about Eddie Kowalski's tourniquet and the 90 seconds and the leg that did not survive anyway. He thought about Dennis Webb, 3 meters to his left through all of it, who had never once said anything that wasn't necessary and had never once failed to be exactly where he was supposed to be, which Thomas understood now to be one of the rarest things a human being can offer another human being, and the one thing the Scheldt had taught him to recognize on sight. He went home to Simcoe, Ontario in August 1945 and did not talk about it. Not because it was unspeakable, because the people asking were asking about Normandy and Italy and the Rhine, and those were the battles that had names in the newspapers, and Thomas did not know how to explain a battle the newspapers had not named, a battle that existed in the specific weight of wet clothing, and the specific cold of flooded ground, and the specific silence that falls when a man beside you stops moving, and the specific nod exchanged with a Dutch farmer on a road who held his hat in both hands and had no words and did not need them. He married. He had children. They grew up not knowing their father had spent 33 days reading a flooded estuary in the dark. In 1994, 50 years after the Scheldt, the Dutch government held a commemoration in Middelburg. Old Canadian veterans stood on dikes that had been dry for 50 years, looking at fields that had been farmland again for decades, trying to locate in the ordinary landscape the coordinates of extraordinary things. A Dutch woman in her 60s took the hand of a veteran from Hamilton outside the church and held it for a long time, and then said in careful English, "We know. We have always known." He nodded once. The same nod Thomas Harris had given the farmer on the road in November 1944. The nod that means words are not enough, and both people know it, and the knowing is sufficient. 13,000 men, 33 days, 50 miles of estuary taken yard by yard through cold water that appeared in no headlines and earned no monuments beside the names from Normandy and Ortona. The polders are dry now. The farms are working. The cranes never stopped after November 28th.
And in a farmhouse outside Middleburg, someone came home and found a calendar on the wall still marked to October 12th, a child's wooden horse still on the kitchen table, a watermark on the plaster showing how high the water reached, and left that watermark unpainted for years, because some things need to stay visible a little longer than is comfortable, because forgetting costs nothing, and remembering costs exactly as much as the thing being remembered.